G'day. Welcome to the Department of Industry, Innovation and Sciences webinar series on cybersecurity. My name is John Keegan. I'm a business advisor with the department's Entrepreneurs Program, which is a wonderful program for assisting small to medium enterprises in growing their business. We do, together with 100 colleagues around the country, reviews of small to medium enterprises. We analyse your strengths and weaknesses and come up with an action plan that you can use to grow your business. We then essentially set the table for you to access a $20,000 dollar-for-dollar grant to engage specialist resources to help you grow the business. In addition to the business evaluation grant, we have a business growth grant, we have a research grant for up to $50,000 on a dollar-for-dollar basis, and if you have some very special IP and are really growing with a great idea, we have an acceleration commercialisation grant which can give you up to $1 million on a dollar-for-dollar basis. So feel free to have a good look at business.gov.au, Entrepreneurs Program, and you'll find out more about it. Today's webinar is on cloud and outsourcing, and it's number 5 in the series, and it's to be delivered by Hyvint, who are one of the fastest growing cybersecurity firms in Australia. And today we have Nick and Aaron to deliver, but before they start we're going to run a little video.
Welcome. This is the 5th and final webinar covering cybersecurity for small and medium businesses, brought to you by Hyvint as part of the Australian Government's Business Entrepreneurs Program. In today's webinar, we'll be focusing on discussing security considerations that arise in the context of the use of cloud-based services. In other words, using software or computing resources made available to your business on demand via the internet from a cloud provider's servers. This is an increasingly common trend for many modern businesses. Prior to doing that, let's recap our discussion in Webinar 4 around the steps your business can take to develop an incident response capability. Developing an incident response capability is particularly important for your business because sometimes, despite every effort you might make, it's still possible for your business to suffer a breach of some kind, and the steps you take following a breach can make all the difference in minimizing the damage you suffer and casting your business in a positive light. Remember, there are 2 aspects to developing an incident response capability. Firstly, having processes in place before an incident occurs to facilitate an effective response. And secondly, knowing what to do when an incident actually occurs. When it comes to preparation, make sure that your business identifies and where necessary develops relationships with all possible external stakeholders who may need to be involved should you experience a security incident. This includes law enforcement, legal and cybersecurity advisors, supply chain partners, customers and regulatory bodies. Assign responsibility for handling security incidents to a specific person or group within your business. Implement technical measures to aid incident detection and response, such as logging and monitoring of key systems and applications and the use of intrusion prevention and detection technologies. And finally, do a dry run of the incident response process to make sure it actually works in practice. If and when it comes to a time when your business experiences an actual security incident, then remember the following key steps. Firstly, confirm that an incident has actually taken place. The methods you might use to do this can vary, from relying on your security software alerts to seeking the advice of an external incident response partner. Secondly, engage your external support contacts, such as legal and security advisors and your cyber insurance provider. Understand the scope of the breach and then contain and remediate the incident. This typically involves working with external advisors to confirm the extent of the breach and then isolating affected systems from the rest of your IT environment. Do a post-incident review to confirm the incident has been resolved and identify any lessons to be learned that can be incorporated into your incident response process for the future. You can re-watch Webinar 4 at industry.ausgovtv.com. Remember to also check out Security Colony, Hyvint's cybersecurity collaboration platform, at portal.securitycolony.com. Signing up is free, and you can also get answers to any cybersecurity related questions your business is facing from Hyvint's expert advisors. It's now time to kick off our 5th and final webinar. Welcome once again. Hello everyone, welcome once again to our fifth and final webinar. My name's Aaron Ragu from Hivent.
And I'm Nick Elsmore.
In today's webinar we're going to be looking at the specific issue of using cloud-based services or outsourcing arrangements, because this is an increasing trend we're seeing several businesses of all sizes, not just small and medium businesses, do. Firstly, we'll be talking specifically about in this webinar we'll be talking specifically about security considerations you should take into account when you're considering engaging a cloud-based provider or you're looking to engage in an outsourcing arrangement. Firstly, we'll talk a little bit about cloud-based services and what are cloud-based services. At a very high level, cloud-based services involve any situation in which you use an external or service provider, usually who provides these services via the internet, and they can be platforms for developing applications, infrastructure services such as, or computing resources such as servers and databases, or software applications that are made available, and there's a diverse range which I'll talk about in a moment. And these are all made available on demand via the internet to your organisation. And that on-demand aspect is really one of the key distinguishing features of cloud-based services. They're really made on demand to your business, or made available on demand to your business when you need them. And that's a very specific, powerful aspect of cloud-based services. What we've seen in particular in the last few years is that the way many organisations, and this very much applies to Hivent as well, but many organisations out there are really shifting the way that they're managing their IT infrastructure and the way they're managing their applications from really doing things internally to using the cloud more and more, whether in part or whether in whole. So what we're talking about today when we're talking about cloud-based services is not something that's is a future trend that we're going to see in the next few years, but isn't really here today. The reality is cloud-based services and the use of cloud-based services by businesses is very much a mature market today. And we've got that stat up there that Gartner Research have actually estimated that the current market for cloud-based services globally is estimated at around $246 billion US, but there's still significant scope for growth. And what's expected is that by around 2020, that market's going to be worth over $383 billion US, so quite significant numbers there. In terms of the types of cloud-based services that are available, there are three broad categories. And the first is software as a service. And realistically, this is probably the principal interaction that most of the businesses watching will have with cloud-based services. Software as a service, it's a simple concept. It's a situation where a cloud-based provider provides your organization with access to software applications via the internet, and usually using a subscription-based model. Now, the real power in software as a service offerings is that, particularly in the last couple of years, the range of applications which are now available is quite diverse, and that's resulted in a huge growth in the popularity and the use of cloud-based services. So examples include accounting applications such as Xero, chat and collaboration applications such as Slack and HipChat, customer relationship management solutions like Salesforce, office productivity solutions such as Office 365, and webmail, of course, such as Google Mail, Amazon Workmail, and so forth. At the other end of the spectrum of cloud-based services sits what's called infrastructure as a service. And in this type of situation, a cloud-based provider effectively provides you with access to computing resources that you can then use as if it was IT infrastructure that you are managing internally. But you won't be in physical proximity to the infrastructure, but you'll be able to do things like install operating systems, install software on those operating systems, and store data as if that was storage media available within your own organization. So it's really more of I guess we'll talk about this a little bit later on in the webinar, but with infrastructure as a service, you really have much more access to the nuts and bolts of the way the underlying infrastructure operates. And examples there include Amazon Web Services, Amazon EC2, Google Compute Engine, and Microsoft Azure. In between those two types of offerings sits platform as a service. And this might be relevant to organizations particularly looking to, for example, develop software applications. And platform as a service is a situation where a cloud-based provider will set up an environment or such as a development environment, rather than your organization needing to do that internally, and then you can then use that to develop software applications for your own business if that's something that's relevant to you, and we've got some examples there as well. Now, as I hinted at on the last slide, and quite apart from the functionality aspects of these different types of cloud-based services, a key point to appreciate is that the level of control, the level of granularity with which you can control these different types of cloud-based services at what we call the nuts and bolts level will really vary depending on the nature of the cloud service that you acquire. So for example, with a software as a service offering, typically the changes you can make to the way the cloud service will operate will be limited to the settings in the software itself. You won't, in most instances, if not all instances, you won't be able to change the underlying hardware underpinning the operation of that software and that's supporting the operation of the cloud-based service. On the other hand, if you're using an infrastructure as a service offering, generally you will have much greater visibility of the nuts and bolts of the way the cloud service operates. So you'll have access to the underlying infrastructure. You'll be able to configure those at a much more granular level, install the operating systems you wish, the applications on them, and configure them as you see fit and so forth. And that's going to be an important point that we'll discuss later in the webinar, because depending on your organization's needs and the nature of the expertise you have in your organization, that will really affect what type of service is most appropriate for your needs. Another distinction that's worth mentioning at the outset is the distinction between private clouds and public clouds. Now, realistically, for most of the organizations watching, you're going to have your principal interaction with cloud-based services through the use of public clouds. And that's a situation where whether a cloud-based provider is providing you with access to software, infrastructure, or a platform, they're doing so using the resources of a common IT environment that they've set up. So in other words, a shared IT environment that's shared amongst a group of customers of which you are part. And that can be hundreds, if not thousands of customers, depending on the size of the cloud-based provider. Now, the advantage of a public cloud service is that because the costs of setting up the IT environment and providing the service are shared amongst a wide customer base, that creates significant cost efficiencies and economies of scale that can then be passed on to each individual customer. So there are potentially significant cost savings involved that you can have, that you can experience by using a public cloud service. On the other hand, if you have very specific needs, for example, you're intending to use a cloud-based service for a very sensitive purpose, such as storing very sensitive data in the cloud, then it may be more appropriate to look at a private cloud. Now, a private cloud is a situation where a cloud service provider sets up an IT environment that's either dedicated to your specific organization or a subset of organizations of which you're part. And the advantage of this is that you have an environment that's set up specifically to cater to your organization's requirements. But on the other hand, it won't necessarily be able to provide the same economies, take advantage of the economies of scale of a public cloud service. So there won't necessarily be the same cost savings involved, and oftentimes private cloud services can be significantly more expensive than their private counterparts. Oh, yep. And in terms of the advantages of cloud-based services that are commonly referred to, there are a few that are commonly discussed. And I've already talked about the cost savings from an economies of scale perspective. There's also the advantage that many cloud-based services, particularly in software as a service offering situations, offer subscription-based models. Now, the advantage of that, for example, if you need software only for a specific project and for a particular period of time or a finite period of time, rather than paying the often quite significant fees for a perpetual license fee, you can just pay a subscription for the period of time you require and then terminate that subscription when you no longer need the software. And so that, for example, there can be significant cost savings there. An important caveat that we've mentioned on this slide as well, however, is it's always actually important to check the specific subscription packages offered by the cloud provider to actually make sure that they suit your organization's needs. Don't just assume that the service being offered is going to always be cheaper, but as a general rule, there can be significant cost savings involved in using a cloud-based service. The second point that's quite interesting here also is the fact is that nowadays it's well accepted, generally speaking, that the use of cloud-based services generally offers an improved level of cybersecurity compared to what most organizations could manage on their own, particularly small and medium businesses, when it comes to securing the operation of that cloud service, vis-a-vis if you were to manage the relevant IT infrastructure internally or manage the relevant applications internally. And that's again because of the economies of scale involved. Oftentimes cloud service providers are often large organizations that have the resources to invest the money and the human capital significantly more in cybersecurity compared to the average small or medium business. So while a few years ago we saw discussions occasionally that talked about the cloud being insecure, or there were security risks moving data into the cloud, nowadays we've very much moved past those discussions, I think it's fair to say, and there's a lot more maturity around these discussions and acceptance that generally speaking you're going to have equivalent or better levels of security by moving things into the cloud. And finally, reduced operational overheads. And what this talks about is, for example, if you're using a software as a service offering, while if you are managing that software internally, your organization would have responsibility for things like patching and keeping that software up to date and maintaining it and so forth. When you're using a software as a service offering, that's something that the cloud service provider will typically take care of. So that's an operational burden that's taken away from your business. Similarly, if you're using an infrastructure as a service offering, rather than your organization needing to manage malfunctioning hardware or hardware that's out of date and replacing that sort of hardware, that's something that will typically be taken care of by the cloud-based provider. So those are some overviews. That's an overview of some of the advantages that exist when using cloud-based services.
Thanks, Aaron. So moving on now to excuse me. Moving on now to some of the risks that exist in a cloud-based operating model. One of the key things that I'd really mention here is that it's important to not treat cloud-based services any differently to the way you treat normal services within your environment or systems that you would manage yourself. And what I mean by that is using cloud-based services, and in fact using any outsourcing arrangement, doesn't change your organization's obligation to figure out how the information needs to be protected and to make sure that you put the governance processes in place to ensure that that actually happens. Certainly from a regulatory perspective, that's very much the way it's set out. For example, with the Privacy Act, it's ultimately your information to protect, and so using cloud services, using outsourcers, you really can't transfer that liability. You do have to take ownership of the problem and really ensure that you're managing it effectively. Now that being said, the reality is with any type of cloud service, with any type of third party that you're engaging, that you're either giving sensitive information to, or that is providing you with a service that means they have access to sensitive information or have access to your systems, there's a degree of trust that you're placing in that organization, and there's a degree of risk that comes with that, in that you are now allowing that third party to potentially have access to that data, have access to those systems, and you need to be confident that they're going to manage it appropriately and they're going to manage it with the same degree of care that you would yourself and that is appropriate for the information you have. As we've said through pretty much the whole webinar series so far, really one of the key things that informs all of these decisions is a strong understanding of your business. And what I mean by that is understanding the information that you hold. One of the things that often gets talked about in the cybersecurity industry is understanding this concept of your crown jewels. You know, what is the information that's most important to your organization that you need to protect the most? The reality is not all information is created equally. Some IP that you have is going to be so sensitive that you really do not want to release it outside your organization. Other pieces of information are probably pretty day-to-day, and for example with accounting systems, the reality is that most organizations can quite comfortably use a software as a service accounting platform, and the risk of using that is generally speaking pretty manageable and pretty acceptable, and the benefit that you get is significant. And so the key thing, the first step, is really understanding what's the information that you hold, what's the availability requirements that you have around the systems that you're going to be looking at outsourcing, around the information you're going to be looking at handing out, and ultimately how comfortable are you with making that information available. And there are a whole range of issues that we'll talk about as we go through this around the localization of the information, where it's stored, who has access to it, and how that assurance process plays out. But ultimately, the key thing from your business perspective is to start off with a good understanding of the information that you hold, how sensitive it is, and also at a particularly mature level, who might actually want to attack it from a threat perspective. And this is the distinction of understanding whether you're trying to protect from just opportunistic criminals or someone that is actually taking a targeted approach at accessing your information. So moving on to some of the specific things that are important to consider. In the last slide, I was largely talking about issues around confidentiality. So largely talking about the information that you have and making sure that it's only available to the right people. And that includes the cloud service provider in that. The other aspect that's really worth considering is availability. Now with cloud services, it's important to recognize that availability doesn't just relate to the cloud service provider themselves, but ultimately relates to everything between you and that service. So you can have a cloud service in place that is a part of a critical business process, and the cloud service may well be up and running, but if you lose your internet connection, for example, you can't access it anymore, and the impact on your business process is still the same. So it's not enough to just look at a 99.999% commitment of availability from the cloud service provider. You really do have to consider from a business process perspective all of the elements that go into allowing that service to operate and to give you the availability that you require. It's also important to recognize that a lot of the service level commitments that are made by cloud service providers do have certain caveats, or they do have specific ways that they're calculated. For example, a lot of the SLA calculations are based around unintended or unforecast downtime. And what that means is that a service provider can effectively state that they're going to take a system offline for a day for maintenance, and that then won't be counted as part of that SLA calculation. And so it's important to make sure that depending on the criticality of your business process, depending on the availability that you need from it, that you effectively make sure the service that you're looking at and all of the components between you and it are actually going to line up to work and ensure that it's going to meet your requirements. The next part is, again, when you consider the information that you have and the business processes that you have, identifying whether or not any of those are highly sensitive, and particularly whether there are any specific requirements around that. Now, examples are things like if you process payment card data and you need to find a service provider that is able to operate with or use or store payment card industry data, then you need someone that has an attestation of compliance in relation to PCI DSS. If you're in the healthcare industry or the medical industry and you're potentially going to be looking at storing healthcare related data, then you may be looking for a service provider that, for example, is compliant with HIPAA regulations in the US or has some other kind of accreditation or certification that gives you comfort that that provider is suitable to store information at that level of sensitivity. Which again goes back to this principle that not all information is equal, and it's important to understand your organisation's specific requirements and make sure that they're a fit. But the other thing to also recognise is that most of the large cloud service providers now actually have the ability to offer differing levels of security within their platform. So for example, when you're looking at something like AWS or Azure, it's not as simple as simply signing up for a system or signing up for a server, a piece of infrastructure or platform as a service. You certainly can do that, but then there are also add-on services that you can get that will enable things like web application firewalls, that will enable additional layers of encryption in systems like Salesforce. There are also, with many of these services, there are actually third-party add-ons, things like Cloudflare, that you can implement in between the system that you have and the rest of the internet that can add additional layers of security and additional layers of protection. And so cloud services, even though they are largely outsourced and they are largely put in the hands of a third party, it is still really important to take an active role in understanding the security solution that's in place, and in many ways in designing the security solution that's in place to make sure that you're actually getting something that is going to be fit for purpose that you're trying to look at.
Now, quite apart from the security aspects of, what Nick's spoken about is really prudent decision-making processes when it comes to selecting cloud-based services. There might be other broader requirements which also need to be taken into account when you are selecting a service, and it's really important to be aware of these and factor this into your decision-making process up front when you're selecting a cloud service provider, rather than selecting a provider and then finding out further down the track that they don't meet specific requirements that are relevant to your business. So one example we use is if your business or the industry within which your business operates has a requirement or a preference that sensitive data you have, if you're going to put it in the cloud, is stored locally in the jurisdiction in which you're domiciled, so for example within Australia. If that's the situation, then it's important to be aware of that up front when you're selecting a cloud service provider, rather than selecting a provider and then finding out that they store data overseas and there's no option available to store that data locally within Australia. So that's an important point to appreciate as part of the process of selecting a cloud provider, and broader than just considering security. Now, the other aspect to this, and I mentioned this earlier on when I was introducing the different types of cloud-based services that exist, but it's really important to have a good level of awareness of your own businesses and a realistic, I guess, level of awareness of your own business's level of IT expertise and how that factors in to what is an appropriate type of cloud service to select. Now, I mentioned, for example, with an infrastructure as a service offering, you're more likely to have significant power placed in your hands in terms of how you configure that service, and you'll have a much greater degree of access to the underlying nuts and bolts of the service. Whereas with a software as a service offering, typically what's going to happen is you're going to be able to configure the way the software operates, but you're not going to have access to the underlying infrastructure and the platforms underpinning the operation of that software. So if you are a business that doesn't necessarily have a great deal of IT expertise, then it may be more appropriate to select a service such as a software as a service offering where you don't have to configure that underlying platform and the underlying infrastructure. Because if you do select an infrastructure as a service offering and you don't necessarily have the expertise to configure it appropriately, that can create potential security risks and security holes that cyber attackers can exploit.
Just one thing to touch on there around the data localization piece is there's a lot of terminology that gets sort of thrown around in the industry, and one of the things that we hear a lot is this concept of data sovereignty. And it's important to have a reasonably clear differentiation between data localization and data sovereignty. Data localization is really a relatively simple concept about where the data is stored, about the fact that it is stored on servers in a data center in a particular country. Data sovereignty really goes to the next level, and it actually requires that, but it also has some pretty strict requirements around who can access the data at all. So for example, true data sovereignty means that the data is not just stored on a particular server in a data center in the country, but also that all of the support staff working in that cloud service provider with access to that information are also either residents of or citizens of that country as well. So that's sort of full data sovereignty. Again, it's something that from a regulatory perspective, sometimes from a government or governance perspective comes up. It's important to understand what people are talking about to make sure that you can effectively meet those requirements.
So, as an example of the scenario I've mentioned of a potential misconfiguration of a cloud service creating issues, Amazon Web Services offer an infrastructure as a service offering called Amazon S3 storage buckets. And this is effectively a situation where a large storage repository is made available to customers to store significant amounts of data, and it's an infrastructure as a service offering. So there are significant amounts of parameters that can be configured in the way that service operates. Now, what has often been found to be the case is that customers have been known to misconfigure the way those buckets operate, so that even though they store sensitive business data in the cloud using the S3 storage bucket service, they actually make that data inadvertently available to the world at large. In other words, anyone who signs up for a free AWS account is able to access that data, even though that's not the intention. So for example, earlier this year, in July, it actually emerged that the details of over 2 million Dow Jones customers, personal and financial details, were exposed because they had been stored in S3 storage buckets which weren't configured appropriately, so they were available to effectively anyone who signed up for a free AWS account. Amazon actually went to the effort of contacting several of its customers to notify them of the importance of actually configuring storage buckets appropriately following that incident. But it just goes to highlight the importance of factoring that into your decision-making process and really having a realistic perception, I guess, of your own level of IT expertise, and using that as a way to help guide you to select either a service that might be an infrastructure offering, or it might be more appropriate to select a software as a service offering depending on the level of expertise you have. Now, carrying on from that discussion, it's also really important as part of the selection process when you're looking at various types of cloud service providers to really understand the proposed delineation of cybersecurity responsibilities between you and the cloud service provider. In other words, what security responsibilities is the cloud provider prepared to assume? And what security responsibilities are going to be placed on your organisation? Very important to have a good understanding of that. Now, again, referring back to the concept of the difference between an infrastructure as a service offering and a software as a service offering, depending on the degree of control and the degree of power placed in your organisation's hands to configure the underlying nuts and bolts of the service, that will really affect typically the level of responsibility your organisation has from a cybersecurity perspective. So for example, if you're using a software as a service offering, then it's most likely that you'll be able to just worry about the settings in the software itself. But for example, the cloud-based provider will take care of patching of the software and keeping it up to date and maintaining and fixing any bugs and so forth. Conversely, if you're using an infrastructure as a service offering, you have significantly more power placed in your hands to customize the way the cloud service operates. You can typically install operating systems with some infrastructure as a service offerings. You can control the applications installed on those operating systems and so forth. But with that power will come more responsibility. So you'll need to make sure that the operating systems are kept up to date. You'll need to make sure that the software installed on those operating systems is kept up to date. So it's very, very important to be cognizant of that as part of this selection process. Now, there are some considerations that you should typically take into account when you're looking at this issue of responsibility. So for example, if you're pushing data into the cloud, who's going to assume responsibility for the security of that data? So for example, does the cloud service provider offer some sort of native platform encryption so that when you push data into the cloud, it's automatically encrypted and the cloud-based provider doesn't have any visibility of it? Or alternatively, is that something that's going to be, that's a responsibility that's placed on your organisation to take care of? Similarly, and I already spoke about this briefly on the previous slide, but things like configuration of operating systems and applications and so forth, and making sure those are configured securely. While if you select a software as a service offering, that's typically going to be something taken care of by the cloud provider. If you're using an infrastructure as a service offering, then it's more likely that that's going to be a responsibility for your organisation. And another very important point is that many cloud-based services offer additional security features on their platform, but it may be that they're not always enabled by default, and it's your responsibility as an organisation to go in and enable them. And so it's very important to be aware of that. So we've spoken about, in the previous webinars, we've spoken about the importance of enabling two-factor authentication. So for some cloud-based services, two-factor authentication may not actually be enabled by default, but the feature will usually be available. And so then it may be your responsibility as the organisation to go in and enable it. Similarly, we've spoken about the importance of, particularly in the context of our last webinar with incident response and detection, we spoke about the importance of using monitoring and logging functions to help with the incident response process. Now, many cloud-based services, or at least a good number of cloud-based services, will offer that sort of functionality, but it may be your responsibility to go in, enable it, set it up, for example, what sorts of events are logged, where they're logged, and for how long those logs are maintained. So very important to be aware of all of those things as part of the responsibilities consideration.
Just one more thing on that as well is when you look at a lot of the popular cloud-based services, so some of the applications, things like Dropbox or Box.com or OneDrive, the sort of file sharing systems. One of the things that's really important to recognise is in the same way that in this slide we're talking about the ability to turn on security features and improve the security. With things like those sort of cloud-based file sharing systems, it's really important to recognise that it's actually very easy to configure things that you effectively take away security. It's really only a couple of clicks in most of those applications to make a particular directory or a particular file either publicly accessible or accessible by a link or to send an invitation. And the question then is, to what extent do you then later on go and remove those files, remove those access, do an audit of who has access to what in those environments. So it's really important to understand that the responsibility that you have around controlling who has access to the data and to how you use the security features in the software, even at a software as a service level, is something that's really important.
So one of the things that we would advocate, particularly in the context of the use of public cloud services, is checking the provider's website, because usually most reputable cloud service providers will have a significant amount of information available on their website discussing the proposed delineation of or what they effectively call their delineation of responsibilities when it comes to cybersecurity. So in other words, what your business will be expected to take responsibility for if you use their cloud service, and what they will take responsibility for. So make sure to check out the website of a cloud service that you're considering using, because usually that information will be available there. Now, when we were talking about the use of a private cloud service, and even just generally when we're talking about using the cloud for highly bespoke and highly sensitive arrangements, it may be possible in some situations to speak with the cloud provider directly and negotiate as part of your agreement with them on the delineation of cybersecurity responsibilities to a point that you're both comfortable with. But realistically, for most organizations watching this webinar, and really the common scenario is going to be that you're going to use a cloud-based service that's offered en masse to several hundred, if not several thousands of customers. And so it's not typically going to be feasible in that sort of situation for you to engage in one-to-one negotiations with the cloud service provider. So that is why it is important to, as I say, follow the instructions in the previous couple of slides and really check out the website and understand the proposed split of cybersecurity responsibilities and factor that into your decision-making process when you're selecting a cloud service provider. Now, a bit of an outlier of a point, I guess, in terms of the previous discussion, but certainly worth mentioning. If you are using a cloud service for example, for the storage of sensitive information, such as personal information, it's important not to just automatically assume that you've abrogated or you've relieved yourself of your legal responsibilities for that information by pushing it into the cloud. So, for example, if you're subject to the privacy requirements in the Australian privacy principles in the Privacy Act in relation to the management of personal information, then just because you push that information into the cloud doesn't necessarily mean that you've relieved yourself of responsibility from a legal perspective for that information. So the important point from this slide to appreciate is whenever you're using the cloud for that sort of purpose, really important to speak with your trusted legal third-party advisors to make sure that you have a good gauge and a good understanding of what your legal responsibilities will be and how they will change, if at all, when you start moving data or when you start using the cloud for a sensitive purpose.
The simple principle, though, is it's your information, it's your responsibility, and really, where it's hosted, whether it's on your computer or someone else's computer, ultimately the obligation is still there to make sure that you're taking the right steps to make sure it's secure. Now, moving on to how you can assess the security or consider the security of a cloud service provider. Given that we've just said over the last couple of slides that the likelihood of you having an ability to negotiate directly is pretty low, then really what you're going to be doing is trying to assess it based on the information that's available in the public domain. Now, the beauty of the major cloud service providers at the moment is that they have had so many of these requests. Obviously, security is such a key part to their business that most of them actually have dedicated websites set up called trust sites or trust centers that contain an extraordinary amount of information about specific regulatory compliance regimes they have in place, about specific standards they follow, all of the documentation associated with that, the security testing reports, and everything else that really is there to give you comfort about the security that's in place. If you're not using those major providers and you're looking at other sort of smaller providers, there are a few specific things that are worth asking for. One that's pretty common is what's called a SOC 2 report. SOC 2 report is a report issued by an audit firm, and it's effectively a review of the security controls and the IT general controls that are in place in one of these organizations. And you can get that report, and that'll give you some level of assurance around the security processes they have in place. Likewise, ISO 27001, which is the international standard for information security management systems, is a standard that largely is followed by most of the IT service providers in the cloud space. And so in many cases you can actually get either their policy documentation, their certification report, or other information associated with that. And lastly as well, if they do have a specific service offering around something like PCI DSS, around payment card data, then they should actually have an attestation of compliance to detail the fact that they also meet the obligations there that they then can pass through to you so that you can be confident that that meets your obligations as well. There's a thing called the Cloud Security Alliance that actually has a really, really great website with a lot of information about security in the cloud and what providers should be able to attest to. One of the most powerful things they have is called the Security Trust and Assurance Registry, or the STAR Registry. And it has a website that basically lists a whole range of cloud service providers that are voluntarily participating in the STAR program. And each of those organizations has actually completed a really, really detailed questionnaire of around 330 odd questions with some specific information about which security controls they have in place. Now, whether or not you have the inclination to actually go and download that and read all 332 answers, the fact that those organizations have actually put forward that level of transparency and made that information available is a really, really great thing. And certainly, if you're dealing with a cloud provider who doesn't have information available in the STAR registry, we recommend that it's something you should ask them to consider participating in, because it really does make it much easier for external firms, whether it's you or whether it's us as specialists, to review that and form a view on whether or not their security is appropriate for your needs. Now, one of the key things that you will unavoidably have to deal with when using a cloud service is managing user accounts. In any of the delineations of responsibility that exist, the reality is once you're provisioned with access to a system, you are almost always going to be responsible for managing your users' access to that system and managing those user accounts. Now, where this can get complicated is obviously if you have a cloud first or a cloud only type policy or approach, and you end up with 5, 10, 20 different cloud services, each of which have their own identity stores, it can be really, really hard to manage that effectively, to make sure that the right people have access to the right systems, and particularly that once someone leaves, that all of the access that they have is removed. Because the reality is these systems are internet-based cloud systems, and so the fact that someone has left your organization really has no bearing on whether or not they can still access a system if the account is still in place. They can still just hit it over the internet and log in. So it's really important to ensure that all of those accounts are removed when they're not needed anymore, and that they're configured securely when you can. One of the most important controls really around that is having two-factor authentication turned on whenever you can. Certainly we recommend that for any cloud-based system that has the option of two-factor authentication, turn it on. Most of the major services now have it available as a native offering. Turning it on really will significantly improve your security profile and help to manage your risk. And when using shared accounts, generally speaking, the recommendation is not to use shared accounts, and certainly we agree with that. However, we also recognize that sometimes there are business reasons why you have to, and you end up with a process that uses a shared account. In that case, what we recommend is using something like LastPass or another password management tool that allows you to securely share credentials between users without other users having to actually see the password. So it actually gives you the ability to share credentials in a slightly more secure way. It's still better to not have to share credentials, but if you have to, do it well. And then lastly, if you do have this situation where you have 5, 10, 15 or 20 different cloud services or more, looking at a federated identity management solution is really worthwhile. So this is solutions like OneLogin, Centrify, Okta. Implementation of these can be complex. It may be something that you need to get an external consultant to help you with, but it really can help manage that situation where someone leaves an organization and you need to be able to disable their account across all of the environments really, really quickly. So it can be a control that will improve and enhance your ability to manage the user base across a diverse set of cloud-based applications. Now, most of what we've talked about so far has been the cloud specifically, but this more broadly is about cloud and outsourcing. Now, outsourcing really has largely been subsumed by cloud service providers in the last few years. But there are still cases where you'll have a more genuine outsourcing arrangement where, for example, you have someone that actually connects into your environment and manages your IT systems. You could have a situation where someone connects into your help desk and effectively provides an outsourced help desk or service desk solution. Certainly there are any number of organisations that will manage your search engine optimization, will manage your social media accounts. So outsourcing, both from an IT outsourcing and a business process outsourcing perspective, is still something that happens a huge amount. And the reality is you need to look at each of those relationships and consider what information do those parties have access to and what systems do those parties have access to. And then figure out what level of security they need to have in place and really what you need to do to get comfortable with that organisation having that level of access. In the same way that you wouldn't just give any other organisation access to your bank accounts, you need to consider whether or not it's appropriate to give any random organisation access to your information or your systems, and the process you need to go through to get a level of comfort about the fact that they're appropriate. Sometimes a contract will be enough, sometimes it won't. So it's important to understand what that third party's approach to cybersecurity is before you give them access. One of the most common ways of doing this is through what's called a security questionnaire, a third-party security questionnaire. There's a version available on Security Colony on our portal that you can access and download, and there are also a significant number available online. One of the best is by the Vendor Security Alliance, and their website is linked from this slide pack. And effectively, the Vendor Security Alliance is a group of online service providers who've come together and put together a set of questions that they recommend that you can use to provide consistency in the information you're requesting from your service providers. And so it goes into a whole range of controls about physical security, data security, background checks of staff, and other technical controls that are in place, and helps you get comfort about the controls that an outsourcing partner have and will put in place when dealing with your information. Two of the things we recommend that you do when you are looking at how you manage an outsourcer. One is ensuring that you monitor their access to your systems. Ultimately, if you're allowing a third party to have access to your systems, you really do need to make sure that you understand what they're accessing and make sure that they're accessing the right things. Now, in previous webinars, we've talked about having a similar set of controls across all of your accounts anyway, about ensuring that the right logging is in place, the right detection systems are in place, so that if there is an incident, you can respond appropriately. Effectively, all we're saying here is that third parties really need to have similar identifiable accounts that can be tied back to individuals, and that those accounts really need to be monitored in the same way so that if unusual behaviour, anomalous behaviour is detected, you can act on that and respond appropriately. And the key there when you're talking about responding appropriately is ensuring that you actually have contractual terms in place that allow you to, one, be notified if something bad happens, and two, to be able to have some rights or some controls in terms of either auditing or being involved in the response process. In the same way that we've said with a cloud service provider, it's still going to be interpreted as your data, and if there's a data breach, you're still going to be the organisation that's most likely going to have to actually make the notification, and you're the one that's going to get the bad press. And so really it's important in that context to make sure that if a third party has a security incident, that they actually are contractually obligated to notify you of the fact that that incident's taken place, and you would want to have some control over how that incident is messaged to the media, how it's communicated, and really that you actually have a key role in it because you are obviously a key stakeholder given that it's your data that's been leaked. And so effectively that concludes the session that we were running through today around cloud security and outsourcing security and some of the things that you can do and put in place to help manage your risk when using third-party service providers and using cloud-based services as well. Now there are some really good external resources that are available that we really do recommend you look at. The Australian Signals Directorate has some fantastic cloud computing considerations for all different levels of cloud services that you may be looking at, and we really recommend that you look at those. There's also a guide that the Department of Industry, Innovation and Science has put together called Using the Cloud to Support Your Business. Again, it's worth looking at that. The beauty of the fact that cloud is now so widely adopted is that there really are some great resources from the Cloud Security Alliance and others that will help make this journey reasonably painless. And as we've said through the whole thing, the cloud really is a great benefit to security in many ways, but at the same time you do need to make sure that you're taking the right steps to ensure that you're doing your part as well. Last plug, Security Colony. We've said it in each of the sessions so far. Please do sign up. It's free to get access, portal.securitycolony.com. There are a whole range of resources, these slides, the cheat sheet that goes with it, and of course all of the previous webinars. Please do sign up. You can ask us any questions, and we're certainly happy to help into the future. And with that, we're happy to take any questions both on this topic and also on any of the topics from the previous webinars. And we'll throw across to Jared to let us know if anything's come through and how we can help.
So we've got one question at the moment, come through from Richard. Richard would like to know, in regards to Blockstack, is the Blockstack environment mature enough to be considered as a viable option?
Look, to be honest, I don't know the Blockstack environment well enough to be able to answer that. What I would suggest is, in fact, I'll answer it this way. Given that I don't know the Blockstack environment well, the approach that I would take if I was trying to figure out whether or not that was a good service provider is I'd go to their website and I'd effectively look for a security section or a trust section. And if they have one, I'd look down that information. And I'm looking for more than just, to be honest, platitudes about the importance of security and we take security seriously. I'm looking for something concrete. I'm looking for the fact that the data center is hosted in an accredited data center. I'm looking for information about their SOC 2 accreditation, whether they've gone through ISO 27001. Do they have penetration testing done? And if they do, can I get access to those reports? And if necessary, I'll get in touch with them and I'll ask them to send me the information that they have that demonstrates the security controls that they have in place. Certainly I would go to the Cloud Security Alliance to see if they're on the STAR register. If they are, I'd go through that and read it. But ultimately, the number of providers that currently exist in a cloud environment is just immense. So you do have to go through this sort of series of steps to evaluate each particular provider, because all it takes at the moment is to spin up a website to have a presence online and a cloud-based business. And in many ways it can be hard to tell the difference between really, really credible organisations and organisations that basically are running out of someone's shed. So it's important to go through and do the due diligence.
And while we've spoken about the cloud introducing improved security, and I mentioned that earlier on in the webinar, that's with the caveat that that's not necessarily always the case. That's why it's important to go through these processes. So moving things into the cloud and using cloud-based services doesn't necessarily make you bulletproof to cyber attacks. So that's an important point to appreciate as well.
Well, you must have done an amazing job explaining everything, because that wraps up all of our questions.
Excellent. Well,
Thank you.
In that case, we will sign off. Thank you for joining us on this webinar and also on the 4 prior to it. We've really enjoyed it. Thanks to the Department of Industry, Innovation and Science. We certainly do encourage everyone to check out business.gov.au, look at the Entrepreneurs Program. Obviously there are some great things, some great offers available there. Obviously, you know, grants, funding and advice and support. It's fantastic that these seminars have been made available. I hope they've been helpful, and hope to see you on the Security Colony.
Thank you.